When I was in grade school, I used to venture off into the mountains near my home. It wasn't a big deal, of course, at the time. In the Southwest, and in particular my town, sometimes neighborhoods would suddenly become wilderness, leading off into the rocky desert. After school, and in the summer, I would spend hours just wandering into the mountains by myself. I usually pretended to be some archaeologist on a hunt for some unknown pueblo, or just looking for dinosaur bones. Anything that would entertain my mind, really, since I had no neighborhood kids to play with. After several hours, before sunset, my dad would always whistle, and no matter where I was, I would run as fast as my small legs could carry me back home. "I don't like you going back in there," he would scold me as I come panting up the driveway. "You could get hurt climbing those cliffs, and there are things back there." He would always put an emphasis on the word things. I would laugh and shake my head. I always thought he meant that I could get bit by a rattlesnake or just run into some stray mountain lion. At the time, though, I was just a dumb kid who thought nothing could really hurt me. I had known those mountains, and they were my playground. Years later, though, my playground stopped being that. My interest had faded over time, and I stopped going entirely at some point. Maybe growing older and finding more indoor interests, like video games and Reddit. So when I was in college, it never came up in my mind, until I was in my second to last year at my art school. The teacher assigned us a project on memory and landscape. I smiled as memories of childhood flooded back. I thought of my mountains. I instantly wanted to do a project on that place. Given a decent amount of time for the project, I set out back to my hometown, eager to get started. I crashed back at my parents' place and told them about the project at the dinner table. My mom and dad looked at each other, then back at me. They knew that I could go very far into those mountains without realizing it, and that I would be by myself. "Hun," my mom started, worried. "I don't think you want to go back in there. It's changed since you've been gone." I shrugged. "I want to do it. It's for a project, and this teacher isn't one to let an assignment slip by. Besides, how bad could it be? A couple of drunks passed out next to a sagebrush?" They didn't say anything. After a while, my dad knew that I was dead set on the project and reassured my mom that I was going to be alright. My mom still looked worried, but let it drop for the night. The next day, I set out early afternoon. My parents had gone to work, and I went back into the mountains. I packed a small bag filled with water, my camera, a sketchbook, and a small snack, and set out. The path I usually take to start out was right behind someone's house. A small hill led up to a wide plateau that had two trails leading out into the wilderness. One led to a neighborhood and a small canyon, while the other led further into the wilderness. I took the one I desired and looked around. My mom was right. It had changed. The sagebrush that was on the plateau was completely gone from one area and looked like it had been tried out for urban development. There was a hole dug not too far from the trail. I took a detour and looked down into it. It didn't even go down a foot before the workers that had started developing must have realized that they would have hit 10 or so feet of solid rock before giving up. I shook my head and went back to walking. When the signs of development were slowly fading and the sagebrush and other weeds started to appear back again, I found myself enjoying the walk. I was getting back into my element, my playground. My good mood went like that for a good 15 minutes until something hit my nostrils. A foul odor ran up my nose. I sneezed and looked around to find the source. Out of the few trees, I found something dark laying next to it. A crow was on top of the black mass and picking at it. Now, I had heard of ranchers, at least poor ones, who couldn't afford their horses and would just let them run wild and leave them to die. I assumed it was the case, and despite the disgusting smell, it had me intrigued. Nothing like this never happened before on my previous treks, and I would certainly want to see it. Morbid curiosity, I suppose. Again, stepping off the trail and being careful of not being too scratched up by the other plant life, I went to examine the animal, at least, what was left of the animal. When I was a few feet away from the thing, I had noticed something that made me shiver. The head was missing. It was just a black body with the head completely ripped off. I stepped forward more. The body was already decomposed badly, but from the torso, I found deep vertical slash marks cutting into its ribcage. Whatever did it missed the ribs and slashed perfectly in between them. The skin and fur already matted to the bones and thus made the cuts more conspicuous. I looked around and found a broken branch, picked it up and slowly inserted it in between the ribs. The branch didn't make contact with anything until I could assume it was on the ground on the other side. I pulled it out quickly. It was clean. This made my skin crawl. Something had mutilated this animal, and it wasn't a mountain lion or coyotes. I stood there for a moment. I became suddenly aware of my surroundings and looked around. There was nothing around me, and what was worse, I could still hear traces of kids in the neighborhood below in the canyon. Something did this so close to civilization. I threw down the stick and made it back to the trail. I looked back to where my house was, just about a mile back. If I turned back now, then it would just be a wasted day and trip. However, I looked toward the direction of the carcass. Whatever it was that had done that to that animal would have been long gone by now. It was probably just some sick band of kids taking out an already dead animal anyway. Making the decision that whatever it was gone, I forgot about it and pressed forward. Another mile down the trail, it started to get more rocky, and at that point, I knew I had to be careful of where I stepped. Scaling up one rocky area, I did notice some other changes. Someone had made some graffiti on the cliffside. In some of the areas, I could see beer cans and some small traces of fires where I knew as a kid there was nothing there. Now usually, this is the place where I hung out most as a kid, just because I liked the rocks and just liked the little crevices they made to hide in and dig around. But for some reason, I knew that I had gone deeper than this place. Taking some quick pictures of one area, I made my way to the top of the cliff. What laid before me was familiar, yet uncharted territory. Juniper and pinyon trees were sprouting from all directions, and the area just opened up to what led to a bigger mountain range. Taking out the water from my bag, I gave a couple of gulps before I went forth. Going through trees and down one hill, I managed to find a dry stream bed below. There was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I had been here before, though I don't remember actually going through this way. I had followed the nature-made trail to an open area. That's when I stopped. I had been in this area before. Cliffs surrounded this area from all sides, except where I had just entered. But it was in the center where I had a sudden recollection of a pillar of rock, right dead center of the small basin. I took a few more steps in. Yes, I remember that pillar. But somehow, something always made me turn back before I could get any closer back then. It was probably my dad's whistle, or some uneasy feeling that I was being watched from one of the cliffs. I hadn't noticed, but I was well into the center of the area, almost halfway towards the pillar when that familiar, uneasy feeling came. That's when I noticed the silence, I could hear nothing, not even a caw from the crows overhead, or even a rustling from any vegetation from the breeze. Almost like I was a kid again. I was about to head back out when something caught the corner of my eye. I turned, and the sight of it made me freeze into place. It looked like a hunched white figure of what I thought was a man. It was completely naked. Its clawed hands clutched the edge of the cliff. It stared at me with black holes for eyes. I opened my mouth to scream, but my mouth wouldn't produce a sound. The creature still stared at me. It twitched its mouth open, grinning at me with sharp, jagged yellow teeth that took up half of its face. Slowly, it put its clawed hand up to his mouth. The thing did something that made my skin crawl. It produced the exact whistle that my dad always used to signal me to come home. As if on cue, I started running. I heard the thing roar behind me and rocks shuffling under its feet. I kept running, my legs being torn apart by the brushes and weeds till I was at the cliff face. I looked behind me, and the thing was still behind me. It was running on all limbs. The black holes for eyes locked onto me, while its mouth opened, wanting to tear right into me. I recklessly jumped from one of the safer sides I knew and kept running, and took the path that led to the closest neighborhood. I heard the thing screech and kept on running for home. When my parents found me, I had locked myself in the bathroom, crying my eyes out. I was scared shitless, and I didn't even know if I was safe. It had probably watched me for years, just waiting for me to come back again. I didn't even want to go to my bedroom that night. The window faced the mountains, and I was scared that thing would be out there, staring at me, waiting, or even coming in to attack me in the night. I stayed in the living room, too afraid to sleep that night, but in the distance, I could hear a faint whistling. The next day, I had seen a police car drive where I usually started my trail. I was too afraid to even look in that direction, but my dad told me that some kids found a body, looking for cans, and the police said they found some dismembered body up there. Can't find the head. They say it was some drunk drinking up there. I didn't say anything. I just packed up my car and left an hour or two later. I still feel uneasy at night, even when I am alone. I could sometimes hear that monster's faint whistling. My parents told me that more and more people going into those hills are either going missing or coming out with reports of what the natives call a skinwalker. I don't doubt them, especially when the whistling starts again.